Good day, everyone, and God bless all of you. My name is Dr. Alex British Chinedu Tasie from Ishopo Community, which is in Ikwere local government area of Rivers State of Nigeria, West Africa. And by the grace of God, I am a writer, a musician, a filmmaker, a football coach, a historian, and a multidimensional thinker. I am also a self-appointed, self-acclaimed president of the Nigerian semi-educated people. The people in Nigeria that you say and think are not highly educated people, are not well-educated people. I am a proud, self-appointed, self-acclaimed president of that group in Nigeria. I am simply called a professor of native intelligence. What I have here to talk about is the slave trade activity in Nigeria and the Nigerian people that are mostly affected. The slave trade activity in Nigeria and the Nigerian people that are mostly affected. I am not talking about the trans-Saharan slave trade activity that happened majorly in the northern part of Nigeria. I am not also talking about the traditional slave trade activity that was even in existence prior to the coming of the Europeans into Africa. What I am talking about here is the transatlantic slave trade activity that came with the white people. I am a natural historian. I am also a research historian and an investigative historian. A natural historian is that historian that approaches the work of history with intelligence, with instinct, with intuition, rather than depending largely or solely on secondary sources. A natural historian is that historian that is not often becomes influenced by the bias, by the sentiment, by the grounds, by the sympathy, by the line of thought, by the mindset of people when doing his or her history work. Rather, that historian that intelligently goes into the field to know better, to know more about his or her subject matter before talking about it, before discussing it, before writing about it. That historian that goes into the field to meet his primary sources, to achieve what he desires to achieve historically. A natural historian is that historian that goes into the field to excavate, to investigate his or her subject matter very, very well, very properly, before arriving at a conclusion. A natural historian is a field historian who goes into the field to know about the people that he or she desires to talk about or write about, to hear their submissions, to hear their versions, to hear their stories before coming to a conclusion. There are other historians too that are found in school classroom. Their job is to disperse, propagate, diffuse what the field historians produce, harness, and hand over to them to teach in the classroom. And they are called academic historians. There are also some academic historians that go into the field also to do the work of history. It is not proper, it is not good as a historian when you want to do your history projects to depend solely or largely on secondary sources, on books and materials produced by other people, especially writers and historians. One of the dangers of depending largely or solely on secondary sources is that you might not understand, you might not know the venom, the hatred, the sentiment, the grounds, the sympathy, the line of thought injected into the book, into the material that you want to use as a reference point. It is true that most historians use sentiment and bias to craft their histories. And they do that mainly because of hegemonic interest and self-glorification, where they pitch their people above other people. So it is essential as a historian or someone who wants to carry out a history project to go into the field and investigate and hear and excavate what you want to know properly by meeting with the people that you want to talk about and also know about their environment before arriving at a conclusion. It is a fact and sacrosanct in history that you must have to rely on what the people will tell you about themselves and not what you think about them. That, of course, is history. Some people say that historians are dangerous people because they may find out, they may bring, about what can destroy a society. That, of course, depends on the approach of the historian and his or her mindset. Some historians do their history works just to misinform people. And when you bring out something to misinform people, and in time to come in the future, someone who is more intelligent, someone who is cleverer, goes into that particular submission or work that you have done, mystifies it, unveils, the potent part or material in that your submission. You are finished. You are finished as a writer. You are finished as a historian. So it is essential that when doing your history work, that you go into the field to discuss with your primary sources. You can rely or even depend on secondary sources when the story is not what is within. That is when you can rely on that. But if it is something that is within that you can reach, there is need for you to go into the field and know about that particular thing very, very properly before coming to a conclusion. It is true that slave trade activity took place in Africa and in Nigeria. It is true that slave trade activity happened in Nigeria and in Africa. Some historians, whether native or international, situate the chronology of the arrival of the white people into West Africa around the 15th century, the 1400s. That is when they say that the white people came to Africa for the first time. It is true that European sail ships reached the shores of West Africa. It is true, of course, that the Portuguese sail ships, as the first European nation to visit West Africa, reached the coast, the shore areas of what we call today Cape Verde and the Guinea area. I want the world to know this, that it is not true as being crafted, as being found out by some Nigerian, some African people who call themselves Africanics, pro-Africans, who say that the initial intention of the white people when coming to Africa was to come and begin slave trade activity. It is not also true that one of the initial intentions of the white people when coming to Africa was to come and rape Africa. It is not also true that one of the intentions of the white people when coming to Africa was to come and pillage and plunder the resources of Africa. It is not also true that one of the intentions of the white people when coming to Africa was to come and diminish the demographic status of the African people, through that evil trade. It is not also true that the white people had a premeditated orchestration, a plot to come to Africa to commit heinous, sinister, wicked, and evil activities. What is true is that the Europeans had an initial intention to come into Africa and other areas that they went to source for raw materials for some of their developing industries. What is true is that the Europeans had an intention to come to Africa initially to come and see how the African people lived. What is true is that one of the earliest intentions or one of the initial intentions of the white people when coming to Africa was to come to Africa and open up Africa, chart Africa for world commerce. One of the reasons initially why the white people came to Africa was to come and advance the way the African people lived. And there were other reasons too that spurred the incursions into Africa by the white people, especially the Europeans. So it is true that European sail ships reached the coast of Africa around the 15th century. It is not also true that immediately the white people reached Africa, they began to carry out slave trade activity. It is not true. European sail ships reached Africa. The issue of slave trade activity began in Africa when some European business people established big farms and plantations, around what we call today Latin America, the Caribbean nations, or generally the Americas. When those big farms and plantations were established around those areas, there was then the need for workforce, for laborers to go to those areas and work in the European farms and plantations. That was what spurred, what precipitated, what motivated the business of slave trade activity in Africa, especially the transatlantic slave trade business in Africa. Away from that, slave trade activity also reached Nigeria. It is not true that immediately the white people landed in what we call today Cape Verde and the Guinea area, they also reached Nigeria at the same time. It took a very long time before they reached Nigeria. Slave trade activity took place in Nigeria. Some Nigerian historians situate the period when this slave trade activity came to Nigeria around the 15th century, and that is a lie. It is a lie, that the slave trade activity took place around the 15th century. I am not talking about when the white people came to Nigeria for the first time for a visit. I am aware through traveler documents, through eyewitness accounts by the white people, that some European nations, especially Portugal, Dutch, and the British, came to what we call today Black Africa, came to Nigeria around the 16th century. Some powerful kingdoms like the Kingdom of Benin, the Kingdom of Nupe, the Kingdom of Oyo were visited by the Europeans around the 16th century. I am aware of all that. What I am talking about is the period when slave trade activity began in Nigeria. Slave trade activity began in Nigeria around the 17th century and the 18th century, which is the 1600s and the 1700s. There is no history book, produced by the white explorers who came to Nigeria, who initiated the slave trade activity in Nigeria, that dates the correct period when the slave trade activity took place. I don't mean books published, written by our own Nigerian, historians who did not see what really happened at that time. I am talking about books produced by the people who came from their home areas to Nigeria to establish the slave trade activity in Nigeria. No date is given. So it is not about presumptions or, conjectures. Slave trade activity began in Nigeria around the 17th century and 18th century. That was when it began. It is not also true that immediately white people reached Nigeria, they began to buy slaves. They first concentrated on other wares that they needed for the industries abroad, before coming to the area of slave trade. Slave trade activity, when it came to Nigeria, the first people that had, the effect of it are the people of Yoruba ethnic nation in Nigeria. The Yoruba people were the first people, or are the first people in Nigeria that slave trade activity reached their area. Around the coast of Yoruba, the Europeans docked and began slave trade activity during the time I have mentioned. Remember that the Europeans did not fly when coming to Nigeria. Also did not come by horse. They came, with their sail ships. And the first areas that they landed, were the coastal areas in Nigeria. So they reached Yoruba land, dealt with the people around the coast, and also penetrated the hinterland of the Yoruba people. They devastated the Yoruba ethnic nation and ravaged the environment. The slave trade activity wreaked havoc in Yoruba land. And so the population of Yoruba was depopulated. So many of their people were carted away as common goods and sold abroad as slaves. So Yoruba nation suffered the heat of the slave trade, venture in Nigeria. You should also have it in mind that that business venture was a two-sided business venture. It was not a business of one party only. The white people collaborated with the traditional people, especially the big chiefs and important persons in the society, to carry out that wicked, mischievous, unholy, sinister, ungodly business, activity that centered on the sale of human beings as common cargoes. So after the Yoruba, the next place that the business reached, the transatlantic slave trade business reached, is what we call today Ijaw ethnic nation. The Ijaw ethnic nation was a powerful ethnic nation in the past. They were famed at that time for canoe making, sword production, and fish production. Most of what they produced, they sold to their neighbors and also sold to the Europeans. But you see, the slave trade activity devastated also the Ijaw ethnic nation. And the demographic status of the Ijaw people were also affected. Many of their people were sold abroad, as common goods. If you go to Europe, you find people of Ijaw ethnic origin, forming part of the populations of some countries in Europe. Just like the people of Yoruba, when you go to Brazil, when you go to Haiti, when you go to Honduras, when you go to the Dominican Republic, you find a quantum of, people from the Yoruba ethnic group in Nigeria forming, a part of the populations of those countries. Even generally in the Americas, you find people of the Yoruba ethnic origin, as part of the populations of those areas. There was a big problem that happened between the Ijaw people and the Europeans. When 3 European people were killed by some members of the Ijaw ethnic, society, around the shores of what we call today the Grand Bonny. The Europeans attacked the Ijaw people around the 1730s, and defeated them. And for the fear of reprisal attacks, the people of Ijaw, fled that area. They deserted their homeland, and through the shores, they moved out to sojourn in other areas that you find them today. But when you ask some Ijaw people why some of their people are found in areas outside the Ijaw, ethnic geography, they tell you that it is because of fishing. That because of fishing, some of the people moved out, and today sojourn in other areas outside Ijaw ethnic nation. That, of course, is not the fact. The fact that there was a scuffle between the white people and the Ijaw people, and that resulted, to some of them fleeing the area to other areas. After the Ijaw, the next place that the slave trade activity reached is what we call to the Efik nation. Through the coastline too, the white people also reached Efik and also devastated that particular area, through that business venture, on human cargo. Many people from Efik land and their neighbors were carted away as common goods and sold abroad to work in a white man's farm and plantations. So the Efiks also had a hit of that business venture in Nigeria when it came to Nigeria. After that, then came about the hinterland. Slave trade activity reached what we call today the hinterland areas, especially the southern part of Nigeria, the hinterland areas, especially what we call Igbo land, around the ending period of the 18th century, the 1700s. That was when the business reached the hinterland areas, and it continued even after the official ban of the business in the year of 1807. Some strong heads, continued with the business, and many of them were also dealt with, because European naval ships patrol the waterways, and many of the offenders were dealt with. The business reached the hinterland area that time. When the white people reached there, they also saw a pool of people, in their large numbers, and they also carted away so many people as possible and sold them abroad as human cargoes, like other Nigerian and West African and African people generally. The Igbos also had so many of their people sold outside, the country by the white people as a result of the slave trade activity. So it reached that area. Some people say that the Arochukwu people were prominent in that business during that era. It is a lie. The Aros were very, very far off from the center of the business. The business centered around the coastal areas, the riverine areas of southern Nigeria, and not in the hinterland. It later penetrated into the land, but it did not stay there. Where the business centered and also the had terminuses, were around the coastal areas of southern Nigeria. So the arrows were very, very far off from the centers of the business. Only people who at that time were very close to the centers of the business, became involved. And that is why, that was why people like King Nana Olomu of Ishekri, contiguous to the river, proximous to the water area, the Kalio of Okreka, the Ama people, family of Gramboni, some other ones in Yoruba land and Efiks became integrated into that business because of their closeness to the center of the business. But the Arochukwu people were very, very far. If you see where they are situated in Nigeria today, they are very, very far off from the coastal areas. So they were not that prominent as middlemen, as some people narrate and say in Nigeria. They were not that prominent. And they hadn't also the pool of resources to be involved in that business. They hadn't the money at that time to be involved in that business. The Aros were particularly at that time slave raiders, slave scouts, and interpreters to the white people. They escorted the white people to go into the hinterland, but they were not actively involved. I'm not talking about the Confederacy of the Aro, where some of the jiggery pokery of the Long Juju was noticed, That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people who actively involved in that slave trade. The arrows were minors at that time. They were not big people in that business. And that is why there's no book today published by the Europeans themselves that initiated the business that mentions any Arab person as being prominent in that business venture. You cannot find any book anywhere written by the Europeans, not books written by our African people, by our Nigerian people. Books written by the Europeans that mentions any Arab person as being prominent. No. And that, of course, why you cannot find the arrows in the Shekiri land. You can't find them in Benin land. You can't find them in Efik land. You can't find them in Ijaw land. You can't find them in Yoruba land because they did not go that far. They only concentrated around what we call today the hinterland area of Igbo land. That's where you find the presence of the arrows, as part of the groups, that make up the Igbo ethnic nation. So they were not that proper and that prominent in that ungodly, unholy, wicked, evil slave trade venture in Nigeria. As I have said, the business had an aftermath. The Nigerian people and the African people who were carted away as common goods were maltreated, ill-treated during that time, especially when they were being transported to the white man's land, to the white man's farms and plantations. Many of them experienced horrendous things, when they were joining to those areas, And the white people, of course, have had backlashes from many African people because of their involvement in that trade. But as I've said initially, it was a business of two groups who partnered together to commit that unholy, business activity in Africa, in West Africa, and in Nigeria. Actually, the business took place in Nigeria, and the first people that had a hit of that business, are the coastal people of what we call today Nigeria. Those around the waters, the water areas, the coastal areas. Immediately the white people came, they landed first there, and they began, that activity. Those that they met initially were mostly affected before they penetrated the hinterland areas of Nigeria. That, of course, was what really happened. The slave trade business, everybody knows that it is an inglorious business venture that devastated the African people, diminished the demographic status of the African people. The northern part of Nigeria did not experience that business because their own, had happened earlier before the presence or arrival of the white people into West Africa. As I have said, the traditional business activity was already in vogue before the presence of the white people into Africa, where big chiefs, owned slaves and used them for their domestic cause and other, duties. Some of them were used to man the case of big chiefs and others. Some of them were used to bury big chiefs when they died. So that kind of business was already there. So it is not true that the white people came to Africa and initiated, slave trade activity. There used to be a kind of slave trade activity traditional to our people already before the white people came into Africa. I am an investigative historian. What I tell you is the fact. My name again is Dr. Alex British Chinedu Tasie. I am a historian that majors in Equatorial history and other Nigerian histories. That, of course, is where I come to the end of this particular, discussion, lecture, or whatever with you. Let's say, Anamekao. In case you want to reach me, you want to contact me for discussion or whatever, or in case you want to abuse me or you want to curse me, the contact is +234 806 369 3609. Anumeka Chineke Goziano, may God be with you all the time. Give you sound health, give you long life. Amen, amen, amen.